You learn how to stay calm before you ever learn how to feel safe. People called you mature, but a lot of that maturity was just fear behaving well. You knew how to read the room before you knew how to read yourself. One change in a voice could rearrange your whole body. Maybe you were the child who never wanted to be a problem. So you became useful, quiet, easy, and strangely older than everyone noticed. And now, as an adult, people still trust you with everything. They just rarely ask what carrying all of it has cost you. You can handle pressure, disappointment, and other people's emotions. But when it comes to your own needs, something in you still freezes. Rest feels suspicious. Asking for help feels embarrassing. Being cared for can feel more exposing than being exhausted. From the outside, it can look like discipline or strength. On the inside, it often feels like never fully unclenching. That is the strange psychology of growing up too soon. The child adapts beautifully and the adult pays for it quietly. Because when childhood teaches you that love is unstable, someone has to become the stabilizer. And children are heartbreakingly good at volunteering for that job. Sometimes nobody asked you directly. The room asked you, the tension asked you, the silence asked you, and you answered with your personality. Maybe home was loud, unpredictable, or emotionally cold. Or maybe it looked fine, but there was no real space for your softer feelings. So you learned to keep those feelings private, not because they were small, but because they were inconvenient to the people around you. That is why so many adults who grew up too soon struggle to recognize their own wounds. The pattern is old enough to feel like identity. But strength formed in isolation has a different texture. It does not relax when support arrives. That is why receiving can feel harder than giving. Giving lets you stay in control, and control once felt safer than trust. You may be the friend everyone confides in, yet when someone asks how you are, your mind goes strangely blank. Some people grew up too soon by becoming tiny adults. Others did it by disappearing, staying small enough not to trigger anything. Both patterns come from the same wisdom. If being fully yourself felt risky, adaptation became love's entrance fee. That is why these adults often look composed while feeling chronically tired. Their nervous system still confuses vigilance with responsibility. They can sit on a couch and still feel behind. They can take a day off and still feel guilty for existing unproductively. The body remembers what the mind explains away. It remembers the kitchen tension, the slammed door, the long sigh, the emotional weather report. Growing up too soon often means becoming emotionally parentified, not always in obvious ways, but in subtle daily ways that shape a life. You may have become the translator, the peacemaker, the mood manager, the child who could tell who needed space before anyone said a word. You learned that being observant reduced damage. You learned that being low maintenance increased approval. And praise can make the pattern harder to question. If your survival strategy got rewarded, why would you suspect it was costing you something? So you carry competence like armor. It shines in school, work, and crisis, but it can hide a private emptiness. Because competence is not the same as feeling held. Functioning is not the same as feeling safe enough to fall apart. They answer emails, remember birthdays, pay bills, calm others, and show up on time. Then they stare at the ceiling feeling strangely absent from their own life. They may struggle to cry in real time. The feelings come later, in the shower, in the car, or 3 days after the conversation. If you had to monitor everything around you, your attention learned to travel outward first. Your inner world became the thing you checked last. So when people say, just express yourself, it can sound simple and impossible at once. Express what, exactly, when you were trained to override it? This is also why boundaries can feel mean even when they are reasonable. Somewhere inside, saying no still carries the old fear of causing trouble. You may set a boundary and then spend hours reviewing your tone. Not because the boundary was wrong, but because your body still associates self-protection with rejection. That is the hidden cost of being easy. You become so skilled at adjusting that your discomfort stops registering as urgent. But handling it has often meant abandoning yourself very politely. It has meant swallowing the first feeling and performing the acceptable one instead. You say, no worries, when there are worries. You say, it's okay, when something in you clearly knows it isn't. Then one day, adult life starts pressing on the exact places childhood built too tightly. A relationship asks for openness, a job asks too much, exhaustion finally speaks. You notice how hard it is to need anyone. You notice how quickly you apologize for taking up space. You text, sorry to bother you, before asking a simple question. You begin requests with explanations, as if your need's a defense attorney. You offer help before you know if you have the energy. You say yes while your body is already saying please don't. If someone is disappointed in you, it can feel bigger than the moment. It can feel ancient, almost moral, like you failed at being safe. That is because children often turn family tension into personal responsibility. When adults around them are overwhelmed, kids assume the problem must be their impact. This person may look dependable at work. They are early, prepared, emotionally controlled, and weirdly calm in emergencies. But inside, they may panic in minor mistakes, not because the stakes are huge, but because errors once felt relationally dangerous. Maybe a spilled drink used to ruin the whole evening. Maybe one wrong tone changed the entire house. People who grew up too soon also tend to confuse usefulness with worth. If love felt more available when you were helpful, being needed becomes emotionally addictive. That can make adult relationships quietly uneven. You become indispensable to people who enjoy receiving, but you feel strangely uncomfortable when the care comes back. You may listen for hours, but shorten your own story. You may comfort everyone else, then say, "I'm fine," because the words come automatically. There is also a loneliness unique to this pattern. It comes from being admired for your strength in the exact places where you feel least known. People thank you for being solid. Meanwhile, part of you wants someone to notice you are tired without needing the performance to crack first. Safe love can feel confusing when your earliest model of closeness involved pressure. Your body may interpret gentleness as unfamiliar, and unfamiliar as risky. Not because intimacy is unwanted, because being truly seen can stir the old fear that your real needs will overwhelm someone. This is why some adults who grew up too soon seem emotionally private even with people they trust. Privacy once protected dignity, dependency, and disappointment all at once. Even joy can get complicated. When life becomes calmer, some part of them keeps waiting for the bill. They may sabotage rest with chores, overthinking, or constant productivity. Stillness creates space, and space can let buried feelings rise. This is one reason burnout hits these people in such a disorienting way. They are often the ones least likely to admit they are overextended. They do not collapse because they are weak. They collapse because carrying too much started feeling normal years ago. What happened is often very quiet. You became a person through adaptation, and adaptation does not announce when it turns into exhaustion. There is usually grief underneath this pattern, not just for what happened, but for what never got to happen. The child who grew up too soon did not only lose ease. They often lost messiness, spontaneity, and the right to be emotionally unfinished. So as adults, they often mistrust their internal signals. Hunger gets delayed, fatigue gets negotiated, sadness gets intellectualized, and anger gets edited into politeness. The painful part is that these adults are often deeply loving people. They notice details, remember needs, and sense what others feel before it is spoken. Their sensitivity became a survival skill, but it can also make them beautiful listeners. The problem is when everyone benefits from that sensitivity, except them. Because insight alone does not undo conditioning. You can understand your pattern and still feel guilty the next time you rest. You can know you deserve support and still hear an old voice saying, "Don't be too much." That is how early emotional roles echo into adult life. The goal was not to shame the part of you that adapted. That part was brilliant, loyal, and probably kept a lot from getting worse. But we do have to tell the truth about the cost. Survival patterns are efficient, yet they often charge interest for years. They know how to endure. They do not always know how to receive, soften, or let life be easier than they earned. And that matters, because endurance can become a trap when it is mistaken for identity. Just because you can carry it does not mean it belongs to you. You may feel proud of being the one who never falls apart, but some part of you may also be wondering when you get to stop auditioning for permission to rest. Real maturity is not becoming emotionally invulnerable. Real maturity is no longer confusing suppression with strength. It is being able to notice your limit before your body turns it into a crisis. It is asking for help without writing a legal brief first. "I'm hurt. I'm tired. I don't want to do this today. I need a little more from the people who say they love me." For someone who grew up too soon, these are not small sentences. They can feel like acts of disobedience against an entire childhood role. That is why change often begins quietly, not with a perfect new personality, but with a small refusal to abandon yourself on schedule. Maybe it is telling a friend, "I actually need support," instead of editing your pain into something easier to hold. Maybe it is not rescuing the room for once. At first, this can feel wrong. Your body may mistake unfamiliar self-respect for danger. But discomfort is not always a warning. Sometimes it is the feeling of an old role losing authority. You were not born overly responsible, overly watchful, or oddly guilty for having needs. You became that way in response to an emotional climate. And responses can change. Slowly, imperfectly, and with a lot of back and forth, but they can change. You can learn that rest is not a moral failure. You can learn that someone loving you should not feel like a debt. You can learn that your feelings do not need to be convenient to be real. They do not need to be pretty to deserve language. Most of all, you can learn that the child in you was never supposed to be that prepared. They were supposed to be protected enough to unfold slowly. That is the ache at the center of this pattern. You were praised for blooming under conditions that required too much toughness. They saw the composure. They did not see the child studying everyone's face before speaking. They saw the reliability. They did not see the kid who learned that one mistake could change the temperature of the whole house. They saw how little you asked for. They did not see how early you decided needing less was safer than needing honestly. You may be tired from a role you started playing years before you've had words for it, a role so familiar it still introduces itself as your personality. But personality is not the full story. Some of what you call who I am is actually what I learned to do to stay connected. And that distinction can change everything. Because what was learned can be questioned, softened, and gradually put down. Not all at once, not cleanly, but enough to make room for a different kind of adulthood. An adulthood where being dependable is a choice, not a sentence, where silence is an option, not a reflex. An adulthood where rest does not have to be justified, where love is allowed to reach you before you prove you deserve it. An adulthood where you do not have to become smaller to keep the peace, where your needs stop feeling like emergencies simply because they are yours. If you had to grow up too soon, it makes sense that you became who you became. But it also makes sense that some part of you is tired of surviving so beautifully. Maybe the deepest truth is this: you were called mature when you were really just alone with too much. And if that still lives in you, it deserves more than admiration. It deserves relief. Because the strongest thing about you was never how much you could carry. It was how early you learned to carry it without being held. But that should never have been the measure of your worth. And it does not have to be the shape of your future.